My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Today we have a very special guest, Professor Emily Mokros. She's a historian at the University of Kentucky who actually just in the time between when we recorded the interview and right now as I'm preparing to get it all ready for release, she actually just got the prestigious PIP Scholar Program. Like I said, I recorded this not knowing she got it, but of course I recognize the caliber of her intellect, so I'm not at all surprised. Stands for Public Intellectual Program. It's a part of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. They have this fantastic program that the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations puts on. They usually get scholars under 45. They take them to a bunch of think tanks here in the U.S. and they take them over to China as well and meet with high-level government officials. It's a really cool program. I've actually tried to get into this myself for the last two cycles, but I lost to better competition each time. Professor Mokros got into PIP, and part of the reason is because of the book that she published that we're going to talk about in today's interview. In 2021, she published a book with the University of Washington Press, which has a great list of books on China if you're interested. The book itself is called The Peking Gazette in Late Imperial China, State News and Political Authority. Professor Mokros's book is a study of the Qing state-sponsored media, that this media outlet, it's hard to call it a newspaper. You know, in the interview, we talk about how it's not really a newspaper, but this media outlet published conversations that the emperor was having with his bureaucrats. We're going to get to that interview in a minute. Just a reminder, my book, China's Backstory, The History Beijing Doesn't Want You to Read, the publication date is September 30th. The book is ready for pre-order. You can go right now as you're listening to this. Go to my website, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. Click on that button that says pre-order my book. And you give them your credit card information. You pay $21.95. And when the book comes out on September 30th, you will be sent a copy. If you pre-order now, you get a little bit of a discount. I think the price after publication is going to be $23.95 rather than $21.95. So you save $2. Okay, that's it for self-promotion. And one more thing before we jump into that interview. If you're interested in buying a copy of her book, I'll link to that on the podcast webpage, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. Go find the interview that I did with Professor Mokros, and on that page with Professor Mokros's interview, I'll have a link to the University of Washington Press's website where you can buy her book. Okay, let's get to the interview. Today, we have a very special guest on the podcast, Professor Mokros at the University of Kentucky. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
A couple of years back, you published a book called The Peking Gazette in Late Imperial China, State News and Political Authority. The book that came out of your dissertation?
Yeah, that's correct. I wrote my dissertation on the Peking Gazette at Johns Hopkins University, and I finished that in 2016. And then after some rounds of revision, I published this book in 2021.
So the Peking Gazette, it's this very important text that's our newspaper-like thing that's published in China, particularly in Qing China. Could you tell us a little bit more about is it fair even to call it a newspaper? Am I wrong in saying it's a newspaper?
You are wrong in some ways because there's no reporting that takes place, and the priority of the Peking Gazette is not to document news per se. But you are right in that thinking about this institution had a lot to do with the history of news in China. To put it briefly, or not so briefly, the Peking Gazette, or Jingbao, is a collection of documents from within the bureaucracy that are circulated with the intention of being read by the bureaucracy. And basically, this comes down to the kind of model of communications in Imperial China, and that extends before the Qing, where people stationed across the empire sent in messages to the court, and then the court or the emperor would respond to these, right? So this is a basic model of communication, and it's how things get done by this sort of cycle of report and response. Now, because these are coming from varied places, sometimes information from the Southwest might be relevant to someone in the Northeast, or sometimes you might want to know about someone's change in position because your own position might be affected. And so it became a common practice to collect these communications and circulate a somewhat redacted version of them and an excerpted section of them for broad readership. And so we have some antecedents of this type of practice as early as maybe the Han Dynasty, definitely in the Tang. But in the Qing Dynasty, this came to its most elaborated format. And so in the Qing, what we see is a system by which the documents that are coming in after they've been responded to by the emperor, there's a prescribed gap after which they can be published in this Peking Gazette. That collection takes place in Beijing and it can be sold in commercial formats. And then it's also transported by the official courier system to provincial capitals for exchange on those levels and reprinting as well. And something that's quite interesting about this then is we think about it in comparison to news, right? There's no reporter in this case. The folks that are acting as reporters are the officials themselves. And of course, the people that are authors of these documents, are talking about things sometimes fairly low to the ground, but sometimes in a macroscopic view, because most of them are high officials. They're governors, governor generals, censors, some capital officials. And they do report, but they're reporting from the position not as they've been hired to report on the scene by the Peking Gazette, but as part of their work as imperial administrators. And so they're balancing that task, that responsibility, and their own personal interests when they report to the throne. And so that gives us a really from the inside out view of the Qing state if we think about this being the type of news that somebody would read during the dynasty. But it also gives us a fairly top-down view. And it also has this aspect that's really quite dissimilar to a modern newspaper or an idealized newspaper, is that timeliness is not really of the essence here. So all of these are published after a prescribed delay, and especially after the emperor responds. But in addition, there's no real impetus, if we look at the archives, to make sure things come out quickly. If a battle takes place or a disaster, there's not any central concern that this type of notice comes out immediately.
No one's worried about getting scooped, as you
Well, they
would.
are in some ways, but not for that. So they're not worried about being scooped as far as reporting. They are interested in being scooped as far as an administrative procedure. So a good example would be if a murder is committed and they're arrested in a distant area and they're awaiting a decision from the Board of Punishments in Beijing. The court wants to balance whether that information is going to come directly in that more confidential, secure memorial versus the Gazette, which is publicly accessible. And in most cases, they want the real record, the memorial, to come first, not the Gazette. So there's actually an impetus to slow things down in order to make the empire function. So I could go on more, but I think I wanted to emphasize those two elements of like reporting and timeliness that make it quite different from a modern newspaper.
So the Gazette is bureaucrats writing reports and sending them off to the emperor, and then those are at some later date published. Is that a good summation?
Yes.
And do we get the emperor's response in the Gazette?
We always have the emperor's response. We usually actually have it before their memorials, the memorials themselves. So the emperor's response might actually come one day and the memorial could come 2 days later. And so another aspect of this is that makes it different from a modern newspaper is that the editor, whoever they are, doesn't play any specific role in bringing those things together for the reader. There's no editorial commentary. There's no framing to say, hey, remember this was discussed 2 days ago. You actually need to have quite a bit of expertise in order to make those links. And so it was something that rewarded sort of constant attention.
One point quickly to make memorial, that is just, if I remember correctly, that's just something that basically a memo that's written to the emperor because, and tell me if I'm wrong, I was taught that it's a memorial because you never tell the emperor anything. You only remind him of something he already knew. Is that right? Memorial is just it's just a very formal term for
Yeah, I've
document.
never heard that quip. That's quite funny. But yeah, it's a formal term for a bureaucratic report between a field or between an official and the throne. So
Hmm.
we have this whole list of these kind of technical ways of talking about communications in Qing governance. And the point of using memorial is that it instantly lets you know the levels between which are being communicated. And so there's different types of communications, for example, between a governor and one of his subordinates in a county that we wouldn't use the term memorial. So it signals
Right.
something about where it is in the hierarchy of power. And that's another point of information about gazettes, that is that they only include things from this higher level of memorial communication, not the communication that happens more at the locality.
Okay. You mentioned earlier that there was the separation between when the emperor's response was published and when the original memorial was published. Was there like a reason for that? To me, I just think I would like to see them both together. But what was the reason for that?
I've never seen the reason stated in a document. However, I think you can consider it's probably an element of the mechanisms by which these materials were released. So there was a
Mm,
procedure in the palace in the evenings where the day's rescripts and edicts, so rescripts are imperial comments upon memorials, and edicts are maybe sui generis announcements or comments or ones that sort of batch, right? They're not attached to one or the other.
mm,
Anyways, each evening these would be produced. And so the premise is that all the folks that wanted to get the latest went to these kind of briefings, and that included the clerks for Gazette publishers. They got that first, then they had to go get the memorials. And so it's an element, maybe this is emphasis on timeliness in some way. It's out, so it gets published. Another aspect is just this sort of prioritization of the imperial word
mm.
that's relevant in Qing and Imperial China more broadly. And in fact, there are versions of gazettes that only contain the emperor's comments. They don't contain the memorials at all. I've never seen it problematized by somebody of the Qing to talk about this, although certainly when people in the late 19th century start making comparisons to different types of journalistic representation, they see that as one of the
Mm.
problems.
You mentioned earlier that their predecessors of the Gazette, the Peking Gazette, as early as maybe the Han Dynasty and the Tang Dynasty. The Qing, you make it clear, is the kind of highest level or the most complex. I don't know the right scholarly term, but it's when it reaches its apogee. Maybe that's fair. But there are some earlier versions of something like this Peking Gazette. Can you tell us about those and how it develops into what we see in the Qing?
Yeah, sure. So I'm not an expert on any of these periods, and the sources for it are much more loose. But broadly speaking, in the expansion of empire during the Tang Dynasty, they relied heavily on these regional commanders who had broad autonomy within their areas. And so those commanders themselves established an office in the capital to manage communications. And so the idea is that this kind of antecedent to late imperial gazettes came out of this kind of joint effort to deliver communications from the capital to those areas. And then the kind of transition that we see is that after the collapse of the Tang Dynasty, and especially its kind of fission by those same ever more autonomous units, generals and such, that the Song Dynasty takes this office, which had been externally motivated or motivated from the periphery, and they revise it so it's a centrally motivated memorials office that puts out a gazette. And so they try to put the energy to the center rather than the periphery. We see attention to court matters and policy among Song commentary. The main scholar that I consult to understand that is Hildy de Weert, whose book Information, Territory, and Networks: The Crisis and Maintenance of Empire in Song China. She has a chapter in that book about what she calls court reports and their use for Song Dynasty intellectuals thinking about the state and the kind of coherence of empire. So, an interesting political function there. If we go into the Ming Dynasty, again, things get a little bit fuzzy. But something that scholars have noted is that by the late Ming, accompanying this sort of major expansion of publishing and commercialization, There's also an expansion of news and references to news. And there's a sort of way in which we see a lot of folks, people collecting diaries, playwrights, poets, triangulating between official and unofficial information sources. And this is where we start seeing especially heavy references to unofficial gazettes or xiaobao, which are compiled by unlicensed publishers and may contain rumors and hearsay alongside those sort of more validated documents. And so when we get to the mid 17th century and the arrival of the Qing conquerors, they are seeing the fracturing of the Ming state in some ways through this fracturing of its control over state news. And so resurrecting the power to put out a circular that makes these authoritative statements is quite central to them. And we see that happening very early on a sporadic basis, and then it seems to be regularized in the late 17th century.
One of the cool stories that you have in this book, you start out at the very beginning of the book with a story about Tong He and him recording a dream. He meets someone who comes back to life from the dead, and the person that he meets claims that they were in the underworld reading the Peking Gazette. Obviously, that's a funny story and a joke. How important was the Peking Gazette? How widely was it read in Qing China?
That's a good question, and it's one that's fairly difficult to answer.
That's the best.
Yeah. The first thing I would say, though, I just have a little bit of a quibble. I don't think that Wang's dream is meant to be a joke in any sense. He's living through a really traumatic time in Qing history, which is the destruction of the Taiping Rebellion. And his family's book collection, like that of many others, had been destroyed. And this is this sort of grievous horror comparable to the loss of life in many ways. And so some of the books that Wang owned were ones that were owned by this collector that comes to him in the dream. So this is like a debt that he's the custodian of this man's books, his finest imprints, and he's failed him. And so I think that's the main part of the dream, this sort of sense of horror. And then what I found really interesting is this juxtaposition of the availability of news, right? And so that the gazettes are meant to represent this kind of lifeline in the world of the dead, where they have a sense of what really is happening, less than a mere impression, and so that they can have a concrete view of it. So it's certainly the main point of the dream is not about the Gazette per se. It's about this kind of sense of horror and things falling apart. And then it's a little odd, actually, that he represents gazettes as continuous because they weren't so continuous in that time. Putting that aside, so about how wide the readership was, it seems to have been very wide as far as serving officials. So I spent a lot of time looking at diaries of officials for the research for this book and in my subsequent research. And almost all of them will talk in some depth, maybe more or less, about readings of gazettes. Almost all of them, if they're traveling, right, from one post to another, or they're administering an exam, they will borrow gazettes from the officials that they have to meet, right? Because it's this kind of like networking journey. You have to meet every official on the way. It's very tiring, but they have to borrow these and look at them on the way. It's a requisite task. Because if they didn't, right, they're away from their post, they're away from their sort of standard documentary stream, they might miss something that they were held responsible for. So it's quite
Hmm.
important for them to do that. If we look more broadly out from them, we can see that most likely gazettes were widely read for people that intended to be employed in the bureaucracy or to work under official auspices. So they might be taking examinations or degree holders, then they might not be, right? We can see that through the types of works that it's cited in, which are lots and lots of sort of administrative texts. We can also see that through some comments in the archives. At some point in the 18th century, the Qianlong emperor scolded a student in an imperial academy for not having read his gazettes, for not knowing that something had happened because it had already been published, so he should know, right?
Hmm.
So there becomes a kind of not so much imagined community, but an imagined standard of knowledge, right? That we all know, right? The base standard of basic knowledge that's established by these because they're not particularly lengthy, right? So it's not too much stuff, but it's what the basics of what's going on. But that said, they're much more accessible in cities than they are outside of cities. And the other thing is that, of course, officialdom is on a very small fraction of the entire population of the dynasty. So beyond that, probably not very widely read per se, but
Okay.
probably quite widely recognized. They had a distinctive silhouette or appearance within the kind of realm of books in late imperial China. They were much smaller pamphlets. In Beijing, they had these yellow, sort of slim yellow covered bodies. They were sold by vendors in cities. And if you open them up, they looked rather distinctive in because many of them were produced with movable wooden type, and so they looked very different from the more orderly appearance of a woodblock book. So I think that most people would recognize that. And so I've had found in my research lots of cases of people carrying or making reference to gazettes that can't actually read them, but make assumption that they'll carry something of value, of official value or relevance to the official state. And so I guess the last thing I would say is that we do see a sort of general broadening of audience over the course of the Qing for two reasons. One of them is that we can generally premise that literacy was expanding in some ways because the book market was filling out nationally over the 19th century. And Cynthia Brokaw's ongoing work is demonstrating that filling out. And so it's an assumption, but I think it's a fair one. We can also see that sort of there's a growing class of people seeking to enter the bureaucracy or have some association with it, especially in the late 19th century. But the second and important factor is that in the late 19th century, when we have newspapers published in China from about 1860 onward, they universally contain excerpts, if not full transcripts, of the content of gazettes. And so that readership, right, then if we say that a mass readership is emerging maybe in the 1890s, is therefore exploding because it's the content of this pamphlet gazette is now available on the front page of a newspaper.
It's widely read amongst official audience or maybe an official aspiring audience. And by the 1890s, you have this expanding readership within China. But it's not just being read within China. You talk a bit about Europeans who are printing this in this kind of early, particularly the Jesuits, this early interest in China, the sinologists going to China and coming back, the sort of early efforts by Europeans to study China. How widely read was the Peking Gazette outside of China?
It was certainly not widely read, but it was very central to constructions of knowledge about China and particularly the kind of contemporary China.
Mm.
If we look at sort of the transitions of sinology from the 17th to the 19th centuries, what we can see is that they feel comfortable using existing books to talk about the history of China, the past dynasties, the Confucian classics, and so on. But when they come to what's going on now, what should they do? There's no history of the Qing being published simultaneously. They don't have access to that. And so what they do is they use this as a document of a sort of power and politics and administration during the present dynasty. They then interpret that for various audiences. And I guess we can see an expansion of those audiences over the course of the Qing period, but I'm not sure that audience ever becomes so sizable, at least in real comprehension. And so I'll explain what I mean. In the 17th century, when we have missionaries associated with the Catholic Church who are in China, and they write back about gazettes. They're writing to the religious organizations that sponsor them, right? To the Vatican and those groups, the Propaganda Fide within that sponsor them. And so this is from a very small group of missionaries to the sort of center of religious power in Rome. Later on, we have groups of missionaries who send their information to other political centers. So, for example, to the French kings, right? They send back sections of gazettes or comments on gazettes talking about the sort of notions of power that are existing in 18th century China. And so people like Voltaire and Diderot, they come across references to these and the types of conclusions that are made about China through them. And of course, China and gazettes are talked about in a very large collection of missionary letters that's published in French in the late 18th centuries. And it's there, right? That collection, which I'm not going to say the title of because I'm very bad at speaking French off the cuff, but the memoirs, that's a very popular collection. It's very important for sort of constructions of knowledge about China in the late 18th century. There's been a lot of scholarship on it. Gazettes are there, but are they the main topic? Not exactly, right? But they're always present. And then in the 19th century, what we start to see is the rise of British use of these of gazettes. And that happens in missionary periodicals, in newspapers, and in within the British Empire itself. And those audiences, again, are notable but not enormous.
You talked in the book about Robert Morrison, who's a British missionary, I believe. He makes this claim. Tell me if I'm wrong, but as I'm remembering what you wrote in the book, he people have been teaching Chinese using these kind of classic Confucian sources, and Robert Morrison says, let's actually use something that's more contemporary that'll teach the Chinese that's being used on a day-to-day basis, and it will teach missionaries the issues that the officialdom that they're trying to reach and converting to Christianity, that the issues that they're grappling with. Is that about right?
Yeah, so Morrison is part of a group of folks that are concerned about lack of access to Beijing, and that's a major concern, particularly among British folks during that time. So there had been prior missionary access to Beijing, which was restricted in the late 18th century, and but that was never British, right? And so I think Morrison has a couple concerns here. One, he wants to access the type of language that's spoken at court as opposed to language of the South. So it's actually a little bit more nuanced. He's concerned that there's this gap between the written sources that they have, which are these kind of classical ones, but then the vernacular, the teachers that they are managing to hire are all Southern coastal natives who don't speak court Mandarin, right? And so he's afraid that if we manage to make it to Beijing at some point, we won't be able to interact with the court, nor will we understand what's going on. So his language learning story is also a very interesting one, but he fixates on gazettes as a source of information and also a source of kind of vocabulary as in use within the bureaucracy. And that becomes a prevailing concern in language education within first the East India Company because he's hired to work on language training for them, and later on within the British Empire in the kind of foreign service in China.
So, one question I had that might, as a historian, make you nervous. You talk about how in Europe, state media is not respected. It's not considered very valuable in early modern Europe. Whereas in China, the reverse is the case. The authoritative media is the one that's state sponsored, and commercial media doesn't play nearly as much of a role as it does in Europe. I can't help but see parallels to what's happening today. State media is much more authoritative in China today, whereas commercial media is the only thing they really have in Europe. Is state-sponsored media is not nearly as important comparatively. Can you, as a historian, see some of the seeds of what is of the difference today in what was going on in this early modern period, or do you think it's not a good idea to draw this continuity, however tenuous it is?
Yeah, you're right that historians tend to avoid these types of
I
lineages.
was
And the problem with this is that, yes, they're really important resemblances. The problem is the sort of dramatic discontinuity of the 20th century in
mm,
China, which for me makes it difficult to draw too close of a connection. And certainly, I would doubt that the sort of organizers of state media in contemporary China think of themselves in any way as resembling the organizations of the Qing state. But that said, I think that there's maybe an important resonance, which is the kind of purposes that we take when we look at state media, and that can exist in other contexts also, right? For instance, if you were to read the People's Daily, you get the news, right? That's the thing. But that's not really why you're reading it, right? You want to see what the party line is, right? You're interested in who is being put up to advance test policies, right? So there's a sense in which there's these kind of test balloons that they send out there. You're interested in thinking about what the keywords are at any time, how they're going to handle something difficult, right? And so you're not reading to get the latest, you're reading to understand what's going on with it. And I think that was the case with the Peking Gazette as well. And so that is one connection, but I don't see it as particularly isolated to China. We can probably find that in any number of cases. There are folks in the United States, right, who read the congressional record, right? That there's lots of these different types of kind of official records that we look to for different purposes.
I wanted to ask you a follow-up question because there has been in the past decade a return to imperial tradition, or there's been a reevaluation of imperial tradition in China. It sounds like it hasn't filtered into state-sponsored media, and you haven't seen any signs that they're connecting what they're doing at the People's Daily to the Jingbao, the Peking Gazette at all. Is that correct?
I've never asked that question as a research question, but nobody's told me about it. And I think I might have heard about it if something like that was going on.
Okay.
I think that the question of the Qing has certainly, its profile has gone up in China since the early 2000s as a time to celebrate and as a time to think about sort of concurrent achievements. The question of empire, however, remains one, or especially in the past few years, is one that is very fraught and problematic and
Mm.
is de-emphasized to a rather dramatic degree.
One other question I wanted to ask you. So, in the book, you spend a lot of time talking about state concerns over secrecy. It seems very hard to contain that kind of news, okay, that kind of spread of information. But that's a central concern throughout the Peking Gazette, right? Like how news gets out, when it gets out.
Yeah, sure. So secrecy has been a central concern of how scholars look at information in Qing China for a long time. This has to do with the kind of central documentary innovation of the Qing being the memorial system that we talked about earlier, but specifically, this is often called secret memorials. And the idea is that they're only read by the author and the recipient being the emperor. So this was a real thing that was put into place in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. And you can imagine that if you have an expectation as a bureaucrat reading gazettes that you have a relatively full view of affairs, the then implementation of a very restricted channel of communication between one of your colleagues and the emperor, excluding you, and maybe that colleague is of a different ethnicity to you and is writing in a different language, might be somewhat alarming, right? And what we end up seeing is that these kind of transitions within the way that the state is run lead to these moments of tension about the coverage or the position of gazettes. When this secret memorial system is being put in place, we see folks anxious and looking for documents that they presume are now not included in this more open publication form of gazettes. And then this happens in the next decade or so when a group called the Grand Council is formed, which is a very important advisory group to the emperor, and notably is reading those secret memorials together with him. And folks in the provinces who have eyes and ears in Beijing, they say, hey, can you go take a look at what they're doing and get me some of that? And we have these cases of folks leaking documents to get paid, right? It's an economic transaction. What ends up happening is that they find a way to somewhat regularize the way that certain memorials are released into circulation and are able to be published in gazettes. And it seems that those cases of leaking and spying fizzle out in the second half of the 18th century. And so the way I explain it in the book is I see it as a relative success in Qing administration. They figured out an administrative solution to this tension that had emerged because of these transitions in communication. The element of secrecy is one that I think would naturally come up in a complex system of empire with a lot of different moving parts and reasons to want to insulate different information streams from each other. So I try to naturalize that rather than point it out as a kind of exception of Chinese statecraft, which is the way that it was talked about in the 20th century more. I think scholars of our generation don't do that nearly as much either, although it leaks into kind of popular like media representations of China. Of course, the obsession of secrecy and autocracy, its connections to autocracy. And another element of secrecy that comes up in the 19th century is that China's wartime adversaries find suddenly, in the context of military conflict, that they're not finding intelligence in gazettes. So what I mean is that British folks working on the China coast in the early 19th century were used to reading quite useful information about fortifications or local military buildups and so on. And then they seem to go away and they say, oh, they're trying to control this information and keep it secret from us. And there is a certain element of that going on, but it gets embedded into an interesting critique which tries to delegitimize that kind of control of information and say, because this is a public document, a state paper, you can't do that. You can't pick and choose. But that's an instrumental argument.
That's the British who are making this criticism? Or is that a
Yes, yeah.
Chinese criticism, like an internal Chinese elites making the same criticism?
There are later criticisms that are internal, especially around the Sino-Japanese War period, but it's anticipated from outside.
Professor Mokros, it's been fantastic. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a blast.
Awesome. And just a reminder to listeners, the book is called The Peking Gazette in Late Imperial China, State News and Political Authority. Check it out. It's from the University of Washington, wherever good books are sold.